something called the Global China Initiative. We're here today with my colleague Cecilia Hahn Springer, Senior Researcher at the Global Development Policy Center, and Xinwei Ma, the Program Coordinator for the Global China Initiative. And we're happy to be here with you today to announce GDP Center's third in a series of open and interactive databases on China's global economic engagement. Today we release China's Global Power Database that tracks Chinese policy bank loans and commercial equity stakes by Chinese entities and power plants across the world by generation capacity, by technology, and projects' lifetime carbon dioxide emissions for these plants as well. Less than halfway through the first decade of the 21st century, China's domestic economic miracle became a global one. With an enormous current account surplus, China unleashed incredible amounts of investments across the world, largely denominated in US dollars, in loans, equity, and beyond. While the presence of Chinese overseas investment was seen and felt everywhere across the globe, reliable and comprehensive data about its scale and composition couldn't be found anywhere. Some decided to build narratives around China's global economic footprint without a full understanding of the details. As the saying goes, don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. Elsewhere, including here at the GDP Center, a small industry has emerged over the past decade that attempts to build data sets so that a more empirical-based understanding of China's overseas finance can be harnessed. This was really kickstarted at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University that started putting together estimates of Chinese overseas finance in Africa. The Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute has also long been in this business. And we got into the game, so to speak, with the Inter-American Dialogue in 2012, where we built and produce the China Latin America Finance Database with those folks to these days. The first global data sets of Chinese overseas economic investments were built by the College of William and Mary. And now there's a number of them from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Harvard, University of Zurich, and beyond. Here at the GDP Center, we and our antecedents have developed what we call a double verification method, which is analogous to the methods that were first pioneered by the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, of verifying a project in a language in a host country and also in China through web searches, personal interviews, and basically any method you can. We've got three databases in this realm. One is the China Latin America Finance Database, which is published with the Inter-American Dialogue in Washington, D.C., and that tracks all Chinese development finance in Latin America. Second, with this methodology is the China's Global Energy Finance Database, which tracks all of Chinese development finance in the energy sector, both upstream and downstream, and a new one that'll be released a little bit later this year. As my two colleagues will describe in more detail, China's Global Power Database is a bit of a departure from our previous methodology, so we can learn more specifically about Chinese engagement in power plants, learn more about their technology, about their potential emissions, and so forth. That's not to say that this method is better than the other one. It's a complement and a different angle to get at a different set of kinds of characteristics that we're trying to do. And as we'll all admit, everybody who is trying to do this, regardless of what university you're at, this is an art and not a science. The GDP Center spends a lot of human resources over the course of a year gathering this data, double checking it, and we publish it on a regular basis and revise things that we find are mistakes or no longer happened or were closed or something like that over the course of the year. So, and we rely on not only our own due diligence on that, but for folks like you who learn about projects on the ground that are different than what our first estimates are. And we always encourage that kind of engagement with all of you folks so that we can incorporate all that into our revisions. Let me turn it over to my two colleagues, Cecilia and Xinwei. They'll give you a quick overview of what the general characteristics that you'll find inside the database and get into a little bit more detail on what some of the methodologies are. And then Xinwei will actually walk you through the interactive so that you can get some clues on how to play with it. And then we'll open up to questions and answers with all of you folks. You'll notice that in the bottom right-hand part of your Zoom, there's a Q&A function button. And you can put first and foremost, put your name in there and your affiliation so we can get to know each other, and then ask questions after our presentations. We should have about a half hour to go back and forth with all of you folks. So I'll hand it over to Xin-Wei and Cecilia.
All right, thank you, Kevin, and thank you everyone for your interest, for tuning in to this presentation, introducing the database to China's global power. Let me first share screen. Yeah, can everybody see me? See my screen? Okay. For this presentation, I'm going to start with a few key findings, and then go into the scope and methodology of this database, and then dive into more details of the key findings. So to start with this database, we're able to have a better understanding of the size and scale of the participation of Chinese investment in policy bank finance that is involved in overseas power generation sector. So with this database, we find 777 plus power plants with Chinese investment and policy bank finance participation. And the total generation capacity adds up to about 187 gigawatts. And then in terms of the energy sources of these power generation, we find that 40% of the power generation capacity with Chinese participation is in the form of coal-fired power plants. 27% is in hydroelectric, and then other renewable energy account for about 11%. And then in terms of the climate implications, if we assume all fossil fuel projects that are still under construction or under planning with Chinese investment and development finance participation come online by 2030 and no retirement, among all of these power plants, the accumulative CO2 emissions from 2018 onwards would consume about 1.3% of the global carbon budget, if we want to have a 66% chance of limiting the global warming to 1.5 degrees, according to the IPCC report. And then we're going to look at some different behaviors that we find between the policy bank finance participants and the corporate FDI that are investing in the overseas power generation sector. So before we go into that, I'd like to introduce the scope of this database. So first of all, we're including the projects with the participation of Chinese policy banks, which is the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank, and also with the participation of Chinese foreign direct investment, which includes greenfield investment, which are projects that these corporations initiated, and merger and acquisition, which are those that are acquired by purchases, and also those that involve both of these two types of deals. So in the database, you would see 4 kinds of deal types, with policy bank finance, with greenfield investment, merger and acquisition, and both policy bank and foreign direct investment. And then by this, we would mean that we're not including the EPC participation or the contracting engineering participation of Chinese companies, even though many of the projects would have their participation, and there are many more projects with contracting and engineering participation of Chinese actors, but we're not including them in this database. And then we're also not including the participation of commercial banks, and it also doesn't mean that they're not in the database. It is just that with the scope, we're not covering their activities. And then in this database, we are covering the time frame of 2000 to 2033 that we find with the methodology, and the cutoff is by the information that is available by the end of 2018. and we offer the temporal and geographic distribution of the capacities of the power generation with the involvement of these actors, their statuses, which is, are they already in operation, or are they under construction or under planning? Their technology, which is, are they, what energy sources they're using, and the CO2 emissions from the fossil fuel power plants, and the lenders from the projects with the participation of policy banks, and the deal types. Are they FDI, or are they policy bank financed? So how do we compile this database? As we mentioned, there are policy bank finance sections and also foreign direct investment sections in this database. For the projects with policy bank finance, we basically extracted them from the other database that we have been compiling over the years, the China's Global Energy Finance Database. And for the foreign direct investment projects, we first compiled a list of Chinese companies that are investing overseas in the power generation sector, and then matched them with the Platts database, which is now called the World Electric Power Plant Database, developed by S&P. And then we verified their project status, their other investment details, and then calculated the CO2 emissions with the formula presented here. And with the emission factors, we basically drew from this paper, which gives an estimate of the average emission factors of different types of fossil fuel power plants in different regions and countries in the world. And then this database is drawn from 3 papers done with our past fellows at the Global China Initiative at the GDP Center. And you can find links to these resources on our website and on the interactive website as well. And now let me go into the findings of the database. So first of all, in terms of the size and scale, we find 187 gigawatts of capacity with Chinese participation. And then what does this mean? As we see from the trend, the commissioning of the power plants with Chinese participation started growing around 2008 and peaked in 2017, and is still growing, even though at a slowing speed. And by the end of 2018, we find 106 gigawatts is already online, and this accounts to close to 2% of the world's total capacity outside of China. And then an additional 80 gigawatt is yet under construction or planning, and this accounts for about 1% of the additional capacity needed by 2030, according to the stated policies by countries in the world. And then where are they investing in? So in the graph here, the darker the colors, the more power generation capacity we have recorded with Chinese participation. So here we list the top 15 countries with the most power generation capacity with Chinese investment and finance. So we see the top countries are Brazil, Pakistan, Indonesia, Vietnam, and we see that it is pretty concentrated. So 77% of all the generation capacity that we have recorded with Chinese capital investment are concentrated in these group of countries. And then they're also pretty fossil fuel intensive. We find that 82% of all the emissions that we have recorded from these power plants come from power plants in these countries. And there are also a few exceptions as we find. So for example, in Brazil, in the UK, in Myanmar, so in these countries, the emissions are relatively low, and these are countries where more hydro investment, more other renewable energy investment is received. And the pattern is generally in line with the energy endowment of these countries. And then how are they investing and who is investing in what? So in terms of capacity, we find generally similar amounts of capacities that are invested by policy banks and FDI and in foreign direct investment. But looking at the currently in operation projects, most of the projects, so almost 90% come from either from policy bank or merger and acquisition. And in terms of the ones that are still under construction or under planning, about 3 times the size of the current operating greenfield investment are still yet to come online. And looking at them from the number of projects, we see that there are much larger numbers of power plants that are invested by foreign direct investment, by merger and acquisition, than policy banks. So this shows that the policy banks are investing in much larger projects than the FDI projects. So in terms of the policy banks, we know that they are, we're talking about the China Development Bank and China Exim Bank, and they are investing in also similar amounts of capacity overseas. And the top Chinese companies investing in this sector are listed here. And we also see they're pretty concentrated in the top 10 companies. 77% of them come from these group of companies. Most of them are large Chinese energy companies and SOEs, with the exception of Canadian Solar, which invests solely in solar power generation. And they're also pretty fossil fuel intensive, as we see here. And then it's also interesting to know that all of these countries are also with the exception of Canadian Solar, all invest in multiple energy sources, including renewable. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Cecilia to talk about the energy sources and climate implications.
Thanks, Qinyuan. So in terms of the energy sources of the overseas power plants with Chinese investment and finance, we can see from the bar on the bottom here that about 40% of the capacity is in coal-fired power plants, with hydropower being the second largest energy source at about 27%. And so renewable energy, mainly wind and solar, only accounted for about 11% of the total capacity in our database. On the other hand, if you account by the number of projects instead of the size, that is their capacity, then wind and solar projects respectively accounted for 29% and 17% of the total number of projects, which is not surprising since renewable energy projects are typically much smaller in capacity than coal, gas, and hydro projects. And so the next graph shows that the annual installation of renewable energy by the companies in our data set has generally been on the rise over the past decade. And so we can see under the pending bar on the right of the graph that many of these projects are still under construction or are being planned. And it's also important to note, though, that while renewable energy has been growing, fossil fuel projects continue to take up a significant share of both projects under construction, in operation, as well as those being planned. Next slide, please. So in terms of the deal type distribution for each of the fuel types that we track in the database, Chinese policy banks contributed to almost 3/4 of overseas coal power generation capacity and almost half of the hydropower plant capacity. Meanwhile, the majority of the Chinese overseas investment and finance in gas power plants and renewable projects came in the form of FDI. Next slide, please. So we also estimated the annual CO2 emissions from these plants, and Qinyuan described the methodology earlier. And here in our data set, you can see the CO2 emissions from the fossil fuel plants in our database arranged by country as well as by year. And so in terms of the annual emissions with our rough estimates, these power plants are currently leading to approximately 314 million tons of CO2 emissions per year, which is about 3.5% of the annual CO2 emissions from the global power sector outside of China. And now that's for the currently operating plants. If we also assume that all the fossil fuel projects that are still under construction or under planning come online by 2030, they will add another 211 million tons of annual CO2 emissions, as shown here in this graph of annual emissions. So as we also mentioned in the beginning, we also calculated the cumulative emissions of these power plants as a measure of the total impact. So assuming no retirement by 2030, the cumulative CO2 emissions from 2018 onward from these fossil fuel plants will reach approximately 6 gigatons, which, as Xinyue mentioned, would consume about 1.3% of the global carbon budget, with a 66% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And next slide, please. And so we also wanted to acknowledge the hard work of our former fellows, Zhongshu Li, Xu Chen, and Kehan Wang, as well as research assistants from Amanda Pareja. And I'm going to turn it over to Xinyue to demo the database for you. But first, I wanted to just point out that all of you can follow along at the link or watch Xinyue do it. This is, a really open source interactive platform that anybody can use, journalists, students, hopefully policymakers in some of the countries where this investment is taking place. So we'll let Xinyue demo the database and then continue on to Q&A about whatever you may want to ask.
All right, thank you, Cecilia. So this is what it looks like, the interactive website. First of all, you will be able to see an intro page, which gives you the scope and the brief summary of the database. And then before we go into the interactive map, we would appreciate it if our users could browse the About sections and the frequently asked questions for a more detailed description of the scale and the background resources that are available. For example, we have a policy brief describing the trends and the methodology notes here, talking about how we compiled this database, and the papers that we just mentioned, and the download form here, where you can get a download of the Excel sheet file of the underlying database here. And then for the frequently asked questions, we give you the scope and definitions of the attributes, and we provide a user guide regarding the structure of the interface, and then also explains the caveats of the database. All right, so then let's go into the database. So in terms of the structure, you can see here we provide an overview and multi-attribute comparison, so two options here. And I'm going to start with the overview. So the overview provides mapping and bar charts and project level table for all the projects by their geographical distribution over time. And it also provides the breakdown of the project capacities on both spatial and temporal dimensions, by project status, by their technology, the CO2 emissions from the fossil fuel projects, the lenders for the projects with the participation of policy banks, and the deal types, which is policy bank only, greenfield, investment, merger and acquisition, and with both FDI and policy bank participation. And then we also offer certain spatial aggregation and comparison that are customizable. So first of all, the spatial aggregation and comparison are available by country and by region. So you can choose here, for example, if I choose South Africa, then everything filters through South Africa. And this view is available for each of the options and breakdowns. And then you can also do the same thing with regions. For example, if I choose Africa, then the temporal and spatial view are all filtered for Africa. And so is the breakdown table here. So for the geographic view, you can pick from directly from the map, and you can also choose the region or country of your interest by the drop-down here. And then this little globe icon leads you back to the global view. And also from the temporal comparison or aggregation, you can choose the time frame of your interest here, for example, years before and after the BRI, and then it highlights the years that you're interested in. And you can also click on the year of your interest, and then the map and the table filters through the year that you're interested in. And then click all, it brings you back to the overall view. And then, as you have seen, as I just scrolled through, the simple snapshot overviews are also available by the hovering over of the mouse. So if you hover over a country, it provides you the snapshot of the trend of capacity, and the same thing is available in the other views for technology and emissions, etc. And also the table here can be collapsed into countries or into the feature that is displayed here. And you can also sort through these information. For example, now it is sorted by the capacity. And you can also sort by the CO2 emissions. Or deal types, or the year. And then for the project information, the table displays these main information here. But if you're interested in more detail, clicking onto the project here, or from here, you will be able to see more detailed information and also switch between the table and looking at relatively where it is and where it is on the map, and also how much it is as a percentage of the year, of the investment of the year. And then it also automatically locks the project when you click on it, and unlocks back to the overall view. Okay, so then let's go to the multi-attribute comparison. So here it gives you also options of comparing between countries and regions. For example, let's do these countries, and then it presents you the capacities with Chinese investment in the database in these countries of your choice, the breakdown of their project status, and the breakdown, and also where, in terms of where they are, the energy sources of these projects, and the CO2 emissions from the fossil fuel sectors in the form of a Sankey chart. And this option also gives you a line chart of the estimated annual emissions from the power generation capacities that are presented here. And then if you hover your mouse over, it also presents you the total emissions of the year that we're looking at and which new projects are added to the additional emissions that are coming from the power plants. And also the project table is filtered here that gives us the overview of the countries of your interest. And then you can export the PDF of these two graphs here. And then you can also go back and modify report. The same thing applies for the different regions here. Yeah, so this is the demonstration of the database. I hope people can enjoy, have fun with it, and also use it for a lot of different resources and information. So thank you, everyone. We're happy to answer questions or have more discussion or about the policy implications, etc.
Thanks a lot, Xin-Wei, and just want to reiterate what Cecilia said. This has been a real group effort. We've been really blessed, first of all, with financial resources from a number of foundations to help us put this together, and a number of pre-doctoral fellows and BU students that Cecilia mentioned in that slide. I really want to single out Zhongshu Li, who was a pre-doctoral fellow here a couple of years ago, who helped create some of the algorithms that allowed us to scrape through the World Electric Power Plant database, and Xu Chen. Both of those folks are still PhD students now back at Princeton University, and are some of the lead authors on some of the papers that came out of this. Also, Rohini Kamal and Yanning Cheng, who worked in similar capacities. And I also just want to thank William Kring, our assistant director here at the GDP Center, helped us build the visuals and work with the software company to do it. So I ask everyone to go into the Q&A section of your Zoom, introduce yourself, and ask some questions. How about I field them? I should say we thank all those people who help us, but any mistakes are the responsibility of Kevin Gallagher, Cecilia Springer, and Xin-Wei Ma. So how about I'll take 3 or 4 of them and throw them out there, and the 3 of us can answer them as they come. So we have one from Jacob Mardell. Welcome, Jacob. He is from the Mercator Institute of China Studies, and he wants to ask about the way we count M&A deals. Say you have a 51% acquisition of a Brazilian energy company. Do you count 51% of the existing wattage operated by the Brazilian company? That's one question. Then it looks like we have 2 from Stephanie Metzger. Stephanie is from the IEA Clean Coal Center in London. She's actually writing a report on coal-specific BRI investment. And she wants to know, does our database include data from Chinese commercial banks? I actually see that one come up a number of times. Maybe I'll put this. So this database and these papers do not do commercial finance. We did a paper with the World Resources Institute, which I just put in the chat that folks can download, where we attempted to estimate that for a short period of time. We're working with the WRI to further explore that through future interactives, but at the moment this one does not have that in there. So that's just a quick answer on that one. Then we have Tricia Wijaya. She's from the Asia Research Center at Murdoch University, and she says, given that COVID has caused construction postponement, if not cancellation of many projects, how often is the data updated? I'm sorry, I can quickly answer that one. Our China Latin America finance database and our China's global energy finance database are updated on an annual basis. This one's a little bit more complicated, and since there is a bit of a trickle in the past few years, I think we'll probably be doing this one more like every other year. Raina Kui. She's from the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland and asks, do you have an estimate about the investments beyond the scope of your database, say in terms of the percent of what's covered here? Let me just ask two more, and then we can take another round. Jiang Yifan from the China Dialogue. Also asked about the commercial banks. I answered that one. Diana Castro asks a question. Whoops. She's from Ecuador, and she wants to get a better idea of how the deals work. Or on a deal level, how do the development banks and the foreign direct investment, to what extent does it work? How does it work in general? Why don't we circle through those, and then I can do another round. There's seems like there's lots of questions we can put in here. Cecilia, Xin-Wei, want to comment on any of those?
I think quick answers for the scope beyond the database, I would say I'm not confident to say that. So hopefully we'll have a chance to flesh out that part to better answer this question. And then how does it work for the FDI plus policy bank section? Does Chinese companies finance and construct the project? So it is usually the case. So for an understanding, I think one can say most of the Chinese policy bank finance overseas, and the investments are to support export of Chinese construction and engineering. So I would say most of the projects do have Chinese engineering and construction, but not necessarily 100%. And also, it doesn't mean that they don't have participation of other international financiers or investors. Many of them are co-financed. If you look at the investor ownership percentage in the database, you will have a better idea, I would say. And then for the projects with both Policy Bank and FDI, it is either the project, the Policy Bank is putting in the debt finance, and the FDI and the Chinese companies are putting in equities for the project company, or the Policy Bank is financing the FDI for the Chinese companies. So either way, but we did try to put them as a parallel so that we don't double count.
Yeah, if I could just add to that one a little bit. At first, I just encourage you, and maybe Maureen could put a link to the Global China Initiative in general into the chat there. There is no one-size-fits-all way that Chinese overseas investment is carried out. There are multiple actors engaged in all of this finance that is, according to new estimates that we'll be putting out at least a half $1 trillion. So there's a lot of different. You can't be thinking about China as a monolith. There's a couple papers that you can find, and so we've done a lot of case studies on the ground from all across the world, including one. I know that one of these questions is from Ecuador. There is one paper that we have, Gregory Chin and myself, called Coordinated Credit Spaces, which tries to say, well, here's some general patterns and models. And like Xin-Wei said, often the policy bank is giving a loan to a sovereign government that will pay, create a special purpose vehicle to sort of create the credit space for a particular project. And that's where firms from around the world or Chinese firms get EPC contracts. That's where commercial banks might finance some of those firms that get to be part of those projects. And there can be equity stakes as well. There's a lot of questions which says, gosh, why didn't you have the commercial banks and the EPCs in there? So through our double verification method, on which we and many other scholars use for our other databases, that methodology is just really impossible to get all of those, because that's those are sort of behind the scenes parts of deals that are really hard to trace through those methods. What we've tried to do with this database is work with the World Electric Power Plant database, which has a pretty spotty coverage of some of that. And so the commercial banking part is really the big new nut to crack, which we're working with the World Resources Institute to try to move in on that. Our particular program is really focused on Chinese overseas investments, and so one of the finance and investment. And so one of the reasons why we don't look at EPCs so much is that those are technically services exports, right? There's not equity from a balance of payments perspective. It's not an equity or a loan. That's not something that we've worked on. But I mentioned Xu Chen, a former GDP Center fellow who's a PhD student at Princeton University. In a paper that we just published last week, she did estimate the percentage of projects that are financed by China's development bank, the percentage of participation by EPCs there. So I encourage you, maybe you could pop that one, Maureen, in the chat. I encourage you to look at this paper led by Xu Chen that does have estimates of the involvement of Chinese EPCs in China Development Bank projects. And Xu Chen is working on a new paper that compares those kind of characteristics with Germany and the United States. Cecilia, answers to any of these other questions before I go on to another round?
Yeah, I've been trying to type some answers in there as well. So, yeah.
Should I go to another round then, folks?
Yep.
Okay. Here's the question of the hour. We have a question from Asgeir Barlot, who is a PhD student at KU Leuven in Belgium. And he asks, how will China's net zero pledge influence these financial flows into the future? We have Joris Mueller from the Department of Economics at Northwestern University. He said, you mentioned a third database that'll be launched at the end of this year. What will it focus on? Go to our website, join our email list, and you'll be among the first to know. He has a second question, which is for projects financed by policy banks, do you collect information about involved companies like the contractors, or do you only include information about involved companies as they relate? I sort of just answered that one. We have a couple questions from Divya Narain from the University of Queensland. She's what we're starting to call one of our season ticket holders here. She goes to all of our events. We really appreciate that, Divya. And Divya's question is, do you think regulatory oversight is higher for policy bank finance than foreign direct investment? And what policies guide FDI when it comes to environmental risks in China's overseas economic activity? And then we have Parsifal de Sola, director of the Andres Bello Foundation in Bogota, Colombia, and says, it is not uncommon for Chinese financing projects to be announced, in some cases even officially signed, but end up not being carried out. Does the database account for this in some way? And Divya and Linda Burrows both ask a question that they have impressions that hydro emissions are not counted here, although it is known that methane and carbon dioxide is equivalent to the size of coal in some cases, especially tropical deforestation, something that we've written about. Why have you not included these, or have you? So there are some good questions there from all of that stuff. Let me just quickly answer Parsifal's, which is, as I mentioned earlier, for most of our databases, we update them every year. And when we find out that something didn't come to fruition, or it was closed for some reason, or we thought it was 4 megawatts and it's 15, we're constantly revising that, and so those will be corrected in the next rendition of the of the database, and we always publish a technical note that talks about what the revisions were. Cecilia, why don't we let Cecilia go first this time?
Sure, maybe we can start with the big picture. So China's recent announcement that it will be, it is aiming to be carbon neutral by 2060. So, I think the understanding is that this announcement applies to regulation of domestic emissions. The emissions associated with overseas investments are not typically included in these kinds of pledges. So I think it remains to be seen whether or not, BRI and overseas investment will become linked to domestic climate policies. They are not currently. I do think there could be a link, perhaps, in the strategic aspect of China's overseas investments in relieving domestic overcapacity in certain industries, such as coal-fired power generation. So I think the question that a lot of researchers are asking are, would more stringent domestic climate regulations lead to a further trend of the export of this, for example, coal-fired power capacity overseas? But I think it's a pretty complicated connection, and that may not necessarily occur. But we're definitely all waiting to see what happens with the 2060 commitment. And then to Divya's question about the hydropower emissions associated with reservoirs and hydropower plants. So that is not currently included. We calculate CO2 emissions from fossil fuel power plants only, but I do think that that would be an important way to extend the rigor of our emissions calculations in the future. Our CO2 emissions estimates, they follow established methodology, but it's a relatively simple way of calculating emissions. So as Kevin said, that would be especially important for the hydropower plants, which you can see there are many in our database that are in tropical regions. For some of the other questions, a lot of questions. Let's see. What else have we not answered yet?
I think Divya has the question of does regulatory oversight look higher for policy bank finance than for FDI? Right.
So, the database, doesn't explore questions like regulatory oversight, but what we did do is look at the distribution of the different fuel types that each of these deal types were involved in. And that's one of the slides in the PowerPoint. And you can explore that either in the database or revisiting our slides or our policy brief, which is also on the website. But we found that the policy banks contributed to almost 3/4 of the investment in coal power generation capacity, indicating perhaps a more carbon intensive portfolio, whereas the FDI that we were tracking was more in gas-fired power plants and renewable power plants, indicating a less carbon intensive portfolio. Yeah, thank you, Shinya. That's the slide that we mentioned. So I don't think that that necessarily means that there's stringent regulatory oversight, but there certainly is some kind of incentive, perhaps some kind of incentive structure or political economy questions that are driving these sort of differentials in the types of deals associated with different types of fuels.
I missed one by Alvin Kamba, and I'd be remiss not to take one from him. Alvin Kamba is a former pre-doctoral fellow here at the GDP Center and a PhD student in the Department of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University. He asks, I wonder if there's a correlation between a host country's infrastructure drive and specific types of energy sources. For instance, Indonesia and Vietnam, which have the highest composition of coal-fired power plants in the data set, are also engaging in infrastructure initiatives that might require quicker infrastructure turnaround. Yeah, indeed, the center has done a lot of work on what the drivers are. In terms of the GDP Center's Global China Initiative, all of these data sets are first to try to understand what are the trends. And we do a lot of work, both statistical analysis and case study analysis of what are the determinants, and then finally, what are the outcomes. Those are really the three things that we're focusing on. And we've done a couple papers on the determinants, and this has been led by a non-resident scholar named Kong Bo, who's at the University of Oklahoma, on some of the more qualitative analyses of it, and Zhongshu Li, who is a former fellow here, who's at Princeton, who I've mentioned a couple times already, has built a statistical model to try to analyze these things. And we, in general, what we find is that the flows of this finance is a function of a number of push factors on the Chinese end and pull factors on the host country end. And in many cases, the pull factors on the host country end are more significant than the push factors on the China end. Especially in some of these countries. There's papers on our webpage on solar, wind, and coal, and there's a new paper by the Climate Policy Lab at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy that has done a number of case studies that also verifies, on-the-ground case studies in Indonesia, et cetera, that verifies that, especially when it comes to coal, that it takes two to tango. That there's a big push. A big pull, I guess I would call it, by many of these host countries, looking for it, Malawi, Indonesia, Vietnam, sometimes the Philippines, etc. Aram Ashraf asks, what is our opinion of the new Pakistan government webpage that provides data on the CPEC projects? I know we've consulted that for our data, but unless the two of you have a different opinion on it, I think it's any attempt to be more transparent about all these things, which is exactly what we're trying to do here, is to be welcomed. We haven't gone and scrutinized to see the extent to which we have things that they have, and et cetera, but should probably be on our to-do list. I don't see much else. Is there anything in the chat? Do you folks have any either closing remarks or other comments you want to make?
Well, are we allowed to give a sneak preview of the third database that will be launched at the end of this year, or like a few keywords?
Keywords, yeah, sure. We'll be launching a new spatial database of Chinese overseas development finance, so that folks can do analyses not only on emissions and economic impacts, but be able to do analyses related to biodiversity and things of that nature. Well, everyone, thank you so much for coming and joining us in today's webinar. We encourage you to go to our website, go to the page for these databases, and this one in particular. I think Xinwei did a great job of just highlighting some of the ways that you can interact with these data. And of course, it's all freely downloadable. You can just fill out a form and do your own analysis with it. We encourage you to also look at our GCI webpage and find out about some of the research papers that we do. We're analyzing the trends, determinants, and outcomes related to these data, and to engage more with our Global China Initiative. I'll especially invite you to come back next Wednesday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time for a presentation on Chinese foreign investment in Peru by one of our pre-doctoral fellows, Victoria Chung. So until then, we'll see you next time, and thanks so much for your time and attention.